Kathleen Kennedy is officially stepping down as head of Lucasfilm by the end of 2025. Whether you love or hate her, there's no denying she had a massive impact on Star Wars over the last decade. But let's be real, her time in charge has been one of the most controversial eras in the franchise history. Under her leadership, we've seen some major highs like Mandalorian Season 1 and 2 and Rogue One, but also some serious lows like The Last Jedi splitting the fanbase in half and Solo flopping at the box office. Beyond that, a lot of people feel like Star Wars got way too political under her watch, and not in a good way. So in this video, we're gonna break it all down. What projects succeeded, which ones failed, how she handled the franchise, and why so many fans feel like she did more harm than good. Let's get into it. Kennedy has been in Hollywood for decades, working with some of the biggest names in the industry. She started out as Steven Spielberg's assistant and quickly moved up the ranks, becoming a producer on legendary films like E.T., Jurassic Park, and Indiana Jones. She wasn't just some random executive, she had a serious track record of success. Then in 2012, George Lucas personally picked her to take over Lucasfilm when he sold the company to Disney. On paper, it seemed like a solid choice. She had experience, knew how to handle big budget movies, and had been involved in major franchises before. But what looked good on paper didn't exactly translate into success when it came to Star Wars. At first, she played it safe. The Force Awakens brought back the franchise in a big way, and it made Disney money. But over time, it became clear that her leadership style and some of the creative choices made under her watch weren't sitting well with fans. From pushing out directors to making Star Wars more about politics than storytelling, things started to fall apart fast. Alright, let's talk about how Kathleen Kennedy brought Star Wars back and how it all started falling apart. First up, we had The Force Awakens in 2015, and honestly, this one worked. It brought back the franchise in a big way, introduced new characters, and made a ton of money. Some people said it was just a New Hope all over again, but at the time, most of us were just happy to have Star Wars back. Then came The Last Jedi in 2017. And this is where everything changed. This movie divided the fan base like never before. Some people loved it for subverting expectations, but a lot of fans felt like it completely ignored what was set up in The Force Awakens. Luke Skywalker, totally out of character. Snoke, killed off with no explanation. Rey's parents, nobody. And let's not forget the whole Canto Bight side plot that honestly did nothing. This was the turning point. Instead of just enjoying Star Wars, fans were now fighting over it. And instead of addressing the backlash, Kathleen Kennedy and Lucasfilm doubled down, acting like fans who didn't like the movie were just toxic or couldn't handle change. By the time The Rise of Skywalker came out in 2019, it was clear they had no plan for this trilogy. This movie spent half the time trying to undo The Last Jedi while also rushing to wrap up the story. And let's be real, Palpatine's return? Yeah, that was just thrown in last minute to try and make it feel bigger than it actually was. Now, there were some wins during Kennedy's time. Rogue One came out in 2016, and despite all the behind the scenes drama, it turned out to be one of the best things Disney Star Wars ever made. It felt gritty, it gave us one of the best Darth Vader scenes of all time, and it actually expanded the lore in a way that worked. And then there was Solo, which completely bombed. This movie had a nightmare production, directors got fired, massive reshoots happened, and by the time it hit theaters, fans just didn't care. It was the first Star Wars movie to actually lose money, and after that, Disney scrapped their whole plan of doing a Star Wars movie every year. At this point, it was obvious Star Wars under Kathleen Kennedy wasn't being run with a clear vision. Fans were more divided than ever, and instead of listening to criticism, Lucasfilm just ignored it or blamed the fans. One of the biggest issues during Kennedy's leadership was the insane number of directors getting fired or replaced. Normally, a studio hires a director because they trust their vision, right? Well, under Kennedy, it felt like every other Star Wars project had behind-the-scenes drama. Solo, a Star Wars story, originally had Phil Lord and Chris Miller, but they were fired super late into production because Lucasfilm thought they were making the movie too comedic. Ron Howard stepped in, reshot most of the movie, and boom, first Star Wars box office flop. Episode 9 was supposed to be directed by Colin Trevorrow, but got the boot too. Why? because his script apparently didn't line up where The Last Jedi had taken things. Instead, they brought back J.J. Abrams, who had to rush to patch everything together, and we saw how that turned out. There was also Josh Trank, who was supposed to direct a Boba Fett movie, but after Fantastic Four flopped and rumors spread about him being difficult to work with, Lucasfilm scrapped the whole thing. At a certain point, you gotta ask, was this just bad luck, or was Lucasfilm not giving directors the creative freedom they needed? Because the projects that actually did well had people like Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau involved, guys who actually get Star Wars. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, how Star Wars pushes modern politics instead of telling great stories. Look, Star Wars has always had political themes. The original trilogy was inspired by World War II and the Vietnam War. The prequels explored the fall of democracy, but the difference, those movies let the story come first. Under Kathleen Kennedy, it felt like Star Wars was being used to make statements instead of just telling a good story. The whole "the Force is female" campaign, it rubbed a lot of fans the wrong way because it felt like they were using Star Wars to push a message instead of focusing on making great content. When fans criticized The Last Jedi, instead of listening to the feedback, some Lucasfilm employees basically called them sexist or toxic. It was like, if you don't like this movie, then you must not like diversity. But they just didn't understand. We just want you to respect the legacy characters while telling a solid story. Outside of the politics, another big problem, Disney thought they could just pump out Star Wars content nonstop and people would eat it up. From 2015 to 2019, we got 5 Star Wars movies in just 4 years. That's way too much, especially when the quality wasn't consistent. After Solo flopped, Disney realized they were overdoing it and scrapped all their planned spin-off movies, like the rumored Obi-Wan and Boba Fett films, which later got turned into Disney Plus shows. The constant stream of content made Star Wars feel less special. Back in the day, waiting years for a new Star Wars movie was part of the hype, but under Kennedy, it felt like they were just churning out projects without a real plan. Instead of listening to constructive criticism, Lucasfilm basically went to war with their own fan base. Rian Johnson, the director of The Last Jedi, openly mocked fans who didn't like his movie, calling them man babies. Kathleen Kennedy and others at Lucasfilm acted like any criticism of the sequel trilogy was just from angry fanboys who couldn't handle diversity or change. The result? Star Wars fanbase became more divided than ever, and the franchise started to lose its magic. And the numbers don't lie. By the time The Rise of Skywalker came out, audiences had checked out. Merch wasn't selling like it used to. Theme park attendance at Galaxy Edge was lower than expected, and interest in Star Wars wasn't nearly as strong as it had been before the Disney era. So with all this controversy, mismanagement, and fan division, what's next for Star Wars? Well, Kathleen Kennedy is stepping down in 2025, and that could mean big changes for the franchise. But whether Star Wars can fully recover from the damages done during her time, I don't know. That's still up in the air. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below.